I thought this is not the call for ideas, but the call for remarks. I found the call for remarks thought-provoking, but frustrating. It wasn't obvious to me what to say about the institutions of globalization that would be useful for helping to provoke a research agenda. So I came up with 3 offhand ideas, perhaps one of which is worth pursuing. The first one is the observation that the institutions of globalization have a long history, and that the process that we call globalization has become increasingly structured and formalized and institutionalized over time. I think I would date the institutionalization of the process from the aftermath of World War I. Before that, globalization really occurred on an ad hoc, unilateral or bilateral, non-institutionalized basis. The gold standard was adopted unilaterally by individual governments and countries. A handful of sporadic, generally unsuccessful international conferences to encourage everybody to move in the same direction, notwithstanding to the contrary. Trade deals were bilateral trade deals rather than institutionalized global arrangements. There was no institutionalized regulation of the capital account of the balance of payments or of international capital flows. That began to change visibly after World War I with the League of Nations, the Genoa Conference to encourage the reconstruction of the international monetary system in 1922, cooperative efforts to manage the gold standard and international capital flows, much more systematic cooperation among national central banks to manage the process of financial globalization, the creation of the Bank for International Settlements in 1930 to facilitate the smooth capital account transfers. There were international tariff truce conferences in 1927, 1928. There was the famous London Economic Conference in 1933. Not all of these initiatives were successful, but the process was much more organized and multilateral, and there were attempts at institutionalization of a sort that had no parallel before World War I. And I think that process of further institutionalization continued after World War II with the creation of the IMF, the World Bank, the GATT, etc. This was a much more elaborate system of obligations for the members of these institutions, although in practice a number of those obligations were honored mainly in the breach. The WTO is in some sense the culmination of that process with its dispute settlement panel and its with binding arbitration powers. We now have the Financial Stability Board to coordinate financial regulation and bank supervision. There are a variety of other international standard setting bodies and agencies, and that century of history suggests that this trend toward greater formalization, formal articles of agreement and obligations for members will continue despite occasional setbacks. The big setback, the big challenge, of course, being whether this process of institutionalization can survive nationalist, isolationist, nativist tendencies, whether it can survive Donald Trump in particular. So that's my first theme, if you will. My second one follows on directly from that last sentence. This is not the first time that the US commitment to the process of globalization has wavered. This is not the first time when the US commitment to rules of the road to institutionalizing that process has wavered. It's not the first time the US has retreated into isolationism or when it has concluded that the country can, quote, cut a better deal when negotiating bilaterally. There was the failure of the United States to join the League of Nations after World War I. There was FDR torpedoing the World Economic Conference in 1933 because he thought he could cut a better set of deals acting on his own. There was the refusal of the Congress to ratify the Havana Charter, creating the International Trade Organization. After World War II, not all of those retreats were disastrous for the rest of the world, for the global system, for the United States itself. But I think I would argue that a number of them, in fact, were. So it's important to understand the nature of U.S. Reluctance to participate fully in institutions of globalization, because this is not simply Donald Trump. This is a tendency which goes back a century. I think this tendency on the part of the U.S. Reflects a long-standing isolationist tradition. It reflects the fact that the United States is separated by two oceans from Europe and Asia, so it can afford to be isolationist. It reflects the fact that the country is relatively large and closed. It's not a small open economy. It's been relatively large and closed ever since the Louisiana Purchase. So its leaders don't value international linkages to the same extent as leaders of other countries. They don't appreciate the importance of those linkages. They're aware of the country's large size, so they're naturally tempted to exploit their market power. I think Trump is only an extreme example of those same long-standing instincts and tendencies, and from that flows the challenge or the problem for other countries, which is how to govern globalization without U.S. leadership or full U.S. participation. So many of us are holding our breath to see if we can continue doing so for 8 years until Mr. Trump passes into history, or until Mr. Mueller delivers his report, or whatever. But my argument is that the United States has always been an unreliable partner for other countries concerned with the governance of globalization, and it's important to think about how to deal with that fact. And third and finally, and most briefly, I think I would argue that international institutions have been most successful at sustaining globalization when their influence has been a moderating one, when they have allowed governments, when they have encouraged governments to phase in liberalization and opening measures gradually over time, and encouraged them, allowed them to compensate the losers. There's some interesting counterexamples, like the International Monetary Fund in the period 1995-2000, the heyday of the Washington Consensus, when the IMF was advocating that capital account convertibility should be made an obligation of IMF members, and we know how that turned out.
Wonderful.